Hi, this is Morihiko Nakahara, the music director of the South Carolina Philharmonic, and welcome to our second Masterworks concert of the season, which we are titling it Mozart Symphony No. 40. So, of course, in the second half of the program, we will be performing the aforementioned Symphony No. 40 by Mozart. In the first half of the program, we have two works. First off, we are featuring the violas and cellos, really, of the orchestra in a work by Johann Sebastian Bach. This is Brandenburg Concerto No. 6, and it's really a sort of in between. It's really a chamber ensemble piece, so I won't even be conducting it. It features 7 of our musicians. 2 of the violists in this piece are really the featured soloists in this piece. Following the Bach, we have the Piano Concerto No. 1 by Dimitri Shastakovic, which of course would feature the piano, but this piece also has multiple soloists in a way. When Shostakovich wrote this concerto, he intended this to be sort of a dual concerto for piano, of course, and trumpet. So we have 2 soloists for that concert as well. And then in the Mozart, in the second half, essentially the entire orchestra is featured more or less in soloistic and individual and group manner as well. When we put together these concerts, sometimes there are sort of an overt or obvious thread or connections that run through the program between the composers, between specific works. In this one, at a first glance, it might not be easy to guess how these pieces kind of come together. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes we want to create as much sort of contrast going from one piece to the next to kind of bring out the different aspects of other pieces by kind of pitting them against each other. And that's also kind of an interesting way to create sort of concert programs, or in a way that's sort of creating playlists for Spotify or YouTube and so on. In this program, in the first half, Shastakovich was actually a very huge fan of Bach's music, to the point where and Shastakovich was also a very talented pianist. That's how he really first began his career as on the international stage, was as a pianist, performing in competitions as a soloist, his own music as well as music of others. And he always had an affinity for Bach's writing and Bach's music, to the point where he has several sets of, there was a first set that was written right before this concerto we're about to perform for you tonight. It's called 24 Preludes, and they're in each of the major and minor keys, sort of kind of tipping the hat to the well-tempered clavier set that Bach composed years ago. Another kind of common theme that kind of holds together this concert is the spotlight on the section of the orchestra that probably doesn't get the love very often, and that's the viola section. I mentioned when mentioning the Bach Brandenburg Concerto that it features 2 violists as the focal points, the soloists, the center soloists for this piece. In addition to the 2 viola soloists, there are 2 additional violists who are in the ensemble for the Bach, and they each have sort of almost like a secondary solo role, along with a cellist. And we also have the bassist and harpsichord. The harpsichord, bass, cello unit, or basically these instruments form the unit in Baroque music. We call the continuo part. So they will play the bass part to provide the foundation harmonically and melodically for everything that was going on top. So it's sort of an inseparable unit. But on top of that, instead of using any violins in this piece, Bach basically there are no violins at all in the Brandenburg Concerto No. 6. Instead, you have the 2 viola soloists and 2 section violists who are providing most of the melodic materials and rhythmic interest, along with the continual cello part. In the Shostakovich also has some big moments for the violas as a section, most notably in the finale of the concerto. And Symphony No. 40 by Mozart opens with this restless rhythmic figure that is very familiar to many of you tuning in out there, that starts in the viola section. So it's really sort of, internally we call this program sort of like a viola concert. And why is that? Why is that important? Well, there are many ways to, when you have a huge group of musicians, like we do in orchestra, with various instruments covering various registers from the low all the way to the high, and combinations of instruments, including string instruments, of course, which form the core of orchestral sound, but with all of the winds of brass and percussion and so on. Each orchestra has different characteristics because of the voicing, and a lot of times, a lot of conductors have different ways of wanting to balance things. Some go for sort of the organ-like sonority of various instruments. Some like more of the strong bass sound. Some prefer the. It's like you're adjusting the levels in your car stereo, essentially. And what I really like is the richness in the middle section, sort of the middle voices. And violas often fill that role. And what gives the orchestral sound that added richness often come from a very strong middle section, the middle voices, including the violas. So for this concert, I really wanted to feature our viola section, especially Yves Tan and Scott Garrett, our principal violist and associate principal violist of the South Carolina Philharmonic, who will be featured soloists in the Bach. And so we're looking forward to featuring them, as well as their colleagues in the viola section as well. The Brandenburg Concerto, there are 6 of them, as many of you are probably familiar, or at least have heard some of these, including maybe the snippets of the 6th concerto we're about to play, or the 2nd concerto, which features various solo instruments, of course, in the orchestra. All of these were written before Bach got to Leipzig, where he spent the last significant part of his career and his life creating. Before he went to Leipzig, he worked in the city of Cöthen. And there, he traveled once to Berlin. He was apparently in a search of a new harpsichord. So he went to Berlin to test out different instruments to decide which one to purchase for his office, so to speak, back in Cöthen. And there he met Margrave of Brandenburg, and it was Margrave Brandenburg who commissioned apparently Bach to write a sort of set of pieces that would feature various sections and various individuals of his orchestra. And so that's how the set of these Brandenburg concertos came about. And the number 6, as I mentioned, features the violas. As is the case in a lot of instrumental music of this era, in the Baroque era, a lot of these pieces are influenced, or they're basically dance forms that were popular in Bach's day. So even if they might not have those specific dance names in the title of movements, you can kind of sense the very buoyant, very much a dance-like quality in each of these 3 movements. The first movement is a fantastic exercise in sort of, as a listener, for you to trace the opening idea. What happens is the 2 viola soloists, often in the first movement, are playing the exact same material, but spaced 1/8 note apart. We often hear things like in fugue or canon or so, or round really, where one group of instruments or musicians might start a melody, and it will be quite a few, it could be like 2 bars, 4 bars later, so almost like half of a phrase later, the other voice will join in. In this movement, it happens in such a split second. It creates such a kaleidoscopic effect when 2 people are playing the same idea, but they're spaced so closely apart from each other. It becomes kind of a kaleidoscope, a scope of sound that you can enjoy. Again, this is a fun one, and I don't get to conduct it, which is just kind of sad for me. But what's great in a piece like this is for these members of the ensemble of our orchestra to come together and really make music like chamber music, without a conductor. Oftentimes we feel like conductors, we get in the way of sort of natural music making process. So when you have only 7 musicians in an ensemble like this, it's a perfect opportunity to really kind of showcase these individual musicians and sections and have them kind of work out the process as though they're in a chamber ensemble, which really helps us when we do bigger pieces as well. Then we go to Shostakovich, Piano Concerto Number 1. Dimitri Shastakovic entered the music conservatory at the age of 13. He was in a sense he was a prodigy on the piano and composing as well. And we just finished the latest installment of the famous Chopin competition, one of the most famous piano competitions that takes place in Warsaw. Shostakovich actually was such a talented pianist that he competed, he was selected to compete in the very first installment of the Chopin competition back in 1927. And apparently, he got the honorable mention. He did not win one of the main prizes. One of the reasons apparently why the jury did not choose him to win one of the major prizes at that Chopin competition was because apparently his piano playing was quite unorthodox. There are various writings, various sort of accounts of other musicians who either played chamber music with Shostakovich when Shostakovich was younger. Eventually, he developed some physical issues, so he stopped performing a few decades later, and he basically went into work exclusively as a composer. But reading some of these accounts, they often talk about, well, Shostakovich, he liked to play everything fast, everything loud. People talk about sort of interesting colors that he tried to get out of the piano. Apparently, when he played music of Chopin or other romantic composers, where traditionally a lot of performers would include what we call rubato. Rubato is sort of the freedom of time, stretching a phrase here, and then making up for that little stretch of time by kind of hurrying the next stretch, and so on. So this kind of gives the music sometimes an ability to breathe more. And apparently Shostakovich really didn't prefer doing that. Apparently his playing was sometimes described as being strict. And so maybe that could be part of the reason why he didn't win the Chopin competition. But he wrote this concerto in 1933. So still in his youth, he was born in 1907. He died in 1975. And so this is one of the first of the 2 piano concertos he wrote during his career. He chose a very interesting and you can kind of tell he went through the conservatory years. He kind of gained this reputation both as a pianist and a composer as sort of the wild child of composition, and that's how he became sort of a sensational presence on the international stage. Before the first piano concerto, and even before he went to compete in the Chopin competition, when he was 19 years old, his first big break came as a composer, and that was his first symphony, which was his graduation thesis from the conservatory. And it is so full of wit and one could say sarcastic musical figures and ferocious energy that it essentially got picked up by all these big name conductors and orchestras around the world at the time, and sort of catapulted him into international attention. And you can see those traces of the sort of the sense of humor, sort of sense of sarcasm, mixed with, at times, the sense of melancholy. There's a slow movement of this concerto, which is kind of like a slow waltz. Could be something out of a film soundtrack. And Shostakovich actually, around this time, he was one of the gigs, so to speak, musical gigs that he was doing to make ends meet, was providing music for silent films. and so he had these he had the talent for kind of creating these visual image through his music. And so you can hear all of these kind of elements in this piece. And what's interesting is sort of the instrumental forces that Shostakovich chose to use in this piece. This follows, if you follow all of the big romantic Russian piano concertos, let's say Tchaikovsky's first concerto is probably one of the most famous popular piano concertos out there. And of course, you have all these piano concertos by Sergei Rachmaninoff, which were written earlier in the 20th century. And these are big-boned romantic concertos, often using big orchestras, pinning that against the piano. And Shostakovich specifically said this is not going to be one of those romantic concertos in the veins of Tchaikovsky or Rachmaninoff. He was aiming, he said, for something that was totally different. So he uses the string orchestra, no winds except for the trumpet. So you have the piano, trumpet, and string orchestra. So it's more of a sparse writing. And in a way, it almost kind of goes back to these, what we used to call concerto grosso, which is, could be translated as a group concerto of the Baroque era. People like Vivaldi, Bach, of course, were writing these pieces for orchestral pieces featuring multiple soloists as featured artists. And he's kind of going for the same kind of effect here, pinning the trumpet against the piano with the backdrop of the string orchestra. So it's a fun piece. Shostakovich was also known for creating sort of a musical parodies, if you would, of existing music sometimes. And so in the finale of this concerto, he quotes actually a solo piano piece, sort of a obscure piece by Beethoven, his Rondo Capriccioso, Opus 129, which has a funny nickname, which is called Rage Over a Lost Penny. And Shostakovich actually quotes this piece extensively in the finale of this piece. It's a fun piece to perform. It's very entertaining, very virtuosic for everybody involved. Of course, the piano part, the trumpet part is quite virtuosic as well, and there are many moments for the strings to shine throughout as well. And so for this concert, I'm very particularly excited to welcome back to the Koger Center stage pianist Gilles Fonsatel, who is an outstanding pianist and happens to be a colleague of mine also at the UMass Amherst, where he's been teaching, I believe, since 2010, and performs all over the world as concerto soloist, chamber musician, and soloist as well. And so looking forward to welcoming him back to play this piece. And to play the trumpet solo part for this concerto is James Ackley, who is also the principal trumpet player of the South Carolina Philharmonic, and teaches here at the University of South Carolina School of Music. Incidentally, James and I actually first met when I was doing my master's degree at University of Cincinnati. We often call it CCM for the music program there at University of Cincinnati. And at the time, James was working on his doctorate degree. He had been at the time was the principal trumpet player of the Bogota Philharmonic in Colombia. And I first got to hear James play and collaborate with him back then. And it was such a surprise to actually find him here when I got the job here in South Carolina. And it's going to be a great fun to work with Jill and James and the strings in the Shastakovic. Following the intermission, we have the Mozart Symphony No. 40, which was written towards the end of his life. Mozart died in 1791. He wrote the three final symphonies, symphony numbers 39, 40, and 41. 41 is the Jupiter Symphony, which we performed last season. These three final symphonies were all composed within a short span of time. About 10 weeks total, he created these three grand symphonies in 1788. And this was apparently the time when Mozart was, one often reads, or maybe you might have heard about his money woes, his money troubles, and apparently he wrote these symphonies hoping to find some performance outlet for them. What's interesting, and he's actually there is a letter that he wrote to a longtime friend of his before he finished these symphonies, sort of asking to borrow some money in exchange, essentially, for he's mentioning sort of the prospects coming up to repay that debt. And one of the things he mentions is he's trying to organize a series of concerts at a casino, which sounds kind of weird today to talk about concerts at a casino. That was the thing back in Mozart's day. They used to have ensemble orchestral performances, classical concerts at the casino, which I guess they still do today when you think about Vegas. But instead of Celine Dion or something, Mozart was going to be sharing his latest at the casino in Vienna. The opening of this symphony, once we play the very opening of the first movement, a lot of you go, "Oh, okay, so that's the piece." It's one of those pieces that probably have become so popular in popular culture as well, where the opening strain of this symphony has become so recognizable. Some also consider this particular symphony as almost as a Mozart who is considered a classical composer, as in music of the classical era, kind of foreshadowing and looking forward into the Romantic era, which came right after this. Of course, Beethoven we often think of sort of as the father of the Romantic era, sort of the founding father of the Romantic music tradition. A lot of people kind of set that title with Beethoven. In this symphony, though, you can hear this sort of sense of turmoil, this restlessness, this but then amazing sense of lyricism and drama. After all, Mozart's probably best remembered for his operas, and this symphony came right after he composed Don Giovanni. And apparently, when Don Giovanni was premiered, it apparently bewildered a lot of audience members and critics because it has surprisingly dark elements to it musically, and rather than just sort of delightful entertainment aspect of music. And so Mozart was kind of starting to look into this, kind of probing the dramatic depths of what he could do as a composer with these pieces, especially in the opening movement and the closing movement of the symphony. You can hear these internal struggles, this sense of innovation. Harmonically, we don't often think of Mozart being harmonically adventurous. We often, again, think of Beethoven for that. But there are moments in these outer movements where we know it's in G minor, but he's exploring every other note but that to kind of create this tension before they're ultimately resolved. So he was breaking some new grounds in this music. The minuet movement, which when we think of the minuet, we tend to think of more of a graceful, courtly dance, which of course Beethoven later took it and turned it into something more aggressive and quicker for scherzo. But Mozart was still writing minuets. But this particular minuet doesn't sound that courtly or graceful. It actually, again, sounds a little bit anxious and almost aggressive in a way. And the way he achieves this is, instead of having this typical minuet feel rhythmically, which is basically almost like waltz, but so it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So it's in 3. We feel it sort of in 1. But what he does in the beginning of the minuet, and you hear throughout the main section of the minuet, is he uses what we call Hemiola, which is the feeling of 2 against 3. So even though it's written in 3, it sounds as though we are tripping over ourselves with a 2-beat pattern. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, he would go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. So placing emphasis where we don't usually expect it. And he does this almost relentlessly in this movement as well. So it's all to say that this Symphony Number 40, which is, again, one of the most popular symphonies, probably the most popular symphony by Mozart, is because of that sort of foreshadowing of these dramatic and romantic elements in music that really captivated the audiences since its composition throughout the Romantic era, and of course to today as well. And so there are of course dramatic elements throughout the concert, but then there are also a lot of entertaining, just sheer delight, moments of sheer delight throughout all of these pieces. And putting all of these 3 pieces together kind of creates this a fun, what I almost like to call serious fun. It's sort of the classical pieces that are what I like to call serious fun to perform, and hopefully to join as a listener as well. So thank you so much, and enjoy the concert.